Hello and welcome to this latest LinkedIn Live, and we're looking at navigating cultural differences. I'm here with my transatlantic colleague Nancy Settle-Murphy, who I've worked with since needing to go virtual very rapidly in 2001 when 9/11 hit, and all of a sudden I couldn't travel to the US to meet up with colleagues from all around the world. So Nancy, could you give us a little bit of an introduction? It's lovely to have you here, by the way.
It's always great meeting you, Penny. And I think we met when we were 12, roughly, if I'm
Not
not
quite,
mistaken.
but
So yes, thanks, Penny, for the intro. I am president and founder of Guided Insights based outside of Boston. And I offer facilitation services and training and coaching. And the training that's most relevant here is I've been offering cross-cultural training services since I began my company 30 years ago last week. So this is a subject near and dear to my heart as I've worked around the world, lived in Hong Kong for a short time, and realized how much I didn't know.
congratulations on 30 years of your company, Nancy.
Thank
So
you.
we didn't quite meet when we were 12, but we were a lot younger than we are now, and with less experience. And since then, we've both been working with big corporates and also governments and government organizations to help them to collaborate better, both in person, in hybrid ways, and remotely, of course. Both of us have written books. So Nancy's written a book, which I'm just about to bring up, Leading Effective Virtual Teams. And I've written Virtual Leadership, and also another one, Making Workshops Work. Whoa, let me just remove your one and my other one. There we are, Making Workshops Work. So between us, we've got lots of experience, and we're really looking forward to having this conversation. Now, if you're watching this live, then you have a chance of joining in by adding comments to either LinkedIn or YouTube, depending on where you are. So do feel free to dive in and ask some questions. We will come back to them later on if you ask questions, if you're watching this afterwards. So yeah, let's start off with some stories. So we talked about navigating cultural differences, and the tripwires that you can fall over, the traps for the unwary, in my very first virtual summit in 2010. That seems an awful long time ago. So yeah, should we get going, Nancy?
Yeah, so Penny, I would love you to start off with a real life story, maybe an example where you wished you'd navigated cultural differences a little more effectively, or where you made assumptions that perhaps were erroneous.
Absolutely. And as you know, and I'm sure everyone watching knows, actually you learn an awful lot from making mistakes. And so it's not, it wasn't that long after 9/11 actually that this happened. I was working on a remote team which included developers in India. I'd lived all over the world. I was born in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. I had a childhood in South Africa. I'm married to a New Zealander, lived in England and New Zealand. But I hadn't yet realized at that time the cultural importance of saving face to many countries in the Middle East and Asia. So I asked our developer if he could deliver what he promised by Wednesday. It would be a push, but perhaps it was worth a try. So I thought I'd ask him, expecting to get some pushback. And he answered, "Of course." Wednesday came and went, and I can see from your face, Nancy, that just as I now know, that there was no delivery of the software. I had not allowed for the cultural expectation that he should not expose me to look foolish by disagreeing with me on delivery. I learnt the same lesson in the Middle East, working in Dubai a few years later, where I called out someone in front of the group for flouting one of the group's agreed ways of working. it was face saving, cutting in again, a real cultural difference. A real cultural, it's really core. A friend of mine from China says it's a little bit like something written through her core. It's part of the way that she is. So the next time that happened in a group in Dubai or Qatar, I had a private word to the rule breaker, and it was all sorted really much in a much better way. What about you, Nancy?
Oh gosh, I have so many.
I
But
think we all do.
I think one of the biggest lessons I learned, I had taken an around the world trip as part of some CIO focus groups I was running. So I'd gone from New York, San Francisco, Sydney, Melbourne, and then Geneva and Reading, England. And I was in Geneva with an American friend of mine who lived in Europe for many years. And I was incensed about how I perceived the women being treated there. The men in the office were calling all the women Sheilas. And I was like, what? And I was affronted by that. And he put me in my place. He said, listen, you need to remember, if you're going to be a person of this world, not to go around imposing your values and beliefs on people in other countries. You're not right. They're not wrong. You're just different. So I at first was pretty miffed at him, and then I realized that's exactly what I was doing. I was really angry on if that behavior had taken place in my Massachusetts office, I could have said something, perhaps I should have said something, but not in another country. So that was a big lesson that stayed with me forever.
Okay, now if any of you who are watching, like Laurie, hello Laurie, have any particular stories that you'd like to share, please do feel free to do so in the comments. So I'm going to ask you, Nancy, if you had to pick one mistake that teams make when it comes to navigating cultural differences, what would it be? That mistake that you just see over and over again happening with your clients?
I think the biggest mistake is pretending that cultural differences don't exist, brushing them under the carpet or minimizing them, saying things like, well, at the end of the day, we're all humans, so why are we emphasizing differences? Well, the reason we emphasize differences is so that we can take our first best guess about our respective values and beliefs, behaviors, and norms, so that we don't trip up or make fools of ourselves or affront our colleagues. So it's really about learning enough about another culture and then as a team discussing those differences without judgment. Because when we assume similarities, when we say, well, we're all humans, what we tend to do is see the world through our lens. We're right and you're wrong, just like I described in that encounter with my friend Bill. So I think that if we don't discuss the differences, acknowledge them, and then create a shared team culture, we're going to run up against the same roadblocks every time. So, I'm sorry,
Absolutely.
Penny, go ahead.
I was just agreeing with you and just saying hello to Jessica, who's just joined as well.
So, Penny, if we're not all the same, assuming that we're not, and I also recognize that within a given country or region, there are different cultures. In the U.S., New York culture is very different from uh, Atlanta, is different from Santa Clara. But so if we're not all the same, how can we approach these differences?
Yeah, so we're not all the same. So I suppose it can become overwhelming when you think, gosh, everybody's different. We have to treat everybody as absolutely unique. And that would make life very, very difficult. So what I think, yes, we are unique, but there are some ways in which we are similar. And it tends to come from things like where you grew up, where you live, your profession, your nationality, perhaps even company cultures and so on. So I think it's really helpful to use the fact that we can generalize to a little extent. You know, a well-informed generalization, a non-judgmental generalization may help to give you a best first guess. It may well be wrong. You can't take that and assume that everybody fits that. But perhaps it gives you the beginnings of a way into a particular national culture and so on. So yeah, it's maybe a starting point. So what do you think, Nancy, about that?
Well, I think that's true. I think generalizations are helpful when, as you said, they're well informed, they're non judgmental, versus stereotypes, which tend to be pejorative or evaluative and often are based on maybe secondhand anecdotes, or maybe that one time you met that one person in Paris and assume that all Parisians are this or that. So, speaking of French people, I do a lot of American French cross cultural training. An example of a stereotype would be French people like to argue a lot. Well, that is smacks of being judgmental. Whereas if I say French people generally enjoy a spirited debate, that if I were presenting to a French audience, then I would know to structure my conversation or presentation a very different way. I'd ask challenging questions so they could debate. So I think it's really about the evaluative nature of stereotypes versus the non-judgmental and well-informed generalizations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So something that I think is really trips up global teams, especially in a virtual world, and we'll talk about what makes virtual so difficult in a bit, but language differences can make really cause problems, whether it's an email with the wrong choice of words or something that's said in a virtual meeting or even on the phone. So can you say something about how language differences might prevent us from collaborating effectively?
Absolutely. And I think native English speakers make it harder for everybody else. In fact, we tend not to know how to speak and write our own language nearly as well as people who've learned English. English is actually terribly complicated. Yeah, so it's useful to think about the sort of subset of English which non-native English speakers would use, sort of business English. Just if you think about it, there are a few examples. Let me give you one. If I were to pick my husband up from work, if you think of that, pick up and collect from work, that's actually quite complicated, although it seems very simple to me as a native English speaker. So if I were to say, I will drive to the office and collect my husband from work, then it's much easier to understand. There are all sorts of things around things like the formation, the word formation. French people tend to use that in terms of training. English people tend to use that in terms of setting things up, and you can speak at cross purposes. But generally it's much better, especially if you're virtual, where you don't have as much feedback, if you can use a sort of subset of business English that people are more likely to use. So sometimes the words may seem a little bit more complicated, but use that subset. Yeah, and build in more time as well, so that people have a chance to check in. What would you add, Nancy?
Well, first of all, I want to show this book. I don't know if you can see it, Do's and Taboos of Using English Around the World. Great book about what English words to avoid, like get and make, have about 30 meanings each. So not pretty risky to use that. And Penny, you were talking about some words. I think that the trickiest ones are what French call false friends, except they say that in French. And that is a word that sounds like a word that we would use. So an example of my American French cross-cultural training, I'll never forget, someone from the US office brought in an email from the French colleagues using the verb demander, which is to ask in French, but to us, it's so much like our word for demand that the person was just so put out, like, how dare they demand?
Demande, yeah,
And then,
absolutely.
and
To
then
ask.
demande. And then someone from a French person who was in the US office said, that's just asking. That's not demanding. And they were like, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was a difference. So so yeah, I think it's those words that we have similar words but mean different things can be the trickiest. And I think that in general, in terms of language, especially in a virtual world, we don't have nuances. We can't read the emotions. And even if you select words that come across as you intended, it's how we communicate, and the word choice can really mean everything. So yeah, so I think it's the nuanced communication that is often missed, and that is why we have to use the simplest, shortest words that are most likely to be understood by someone who is doesn't have English as a native language.
Remembering that we probably need to leave out those words like get and put and pick, which can have so many meanings that you talked about earlier. Thank you, Nancy. Have you got a question for me?
You know I do. Yes.
Funny that.
So I've touched on, or we both touched upon some of the complexities and what makes navigating cultural tripwires so much harder in a virtual, remote world. So can you speak about that? What about the fact that we mediate all conversations through screens of some kind or another? What makes that so much harder?
Yeah, I suppose that you miss out so much. Conversation is communicated through our vocal tone, through our body language, as well as the words we use. And all of these things, your body language, obviously, all you can see is this part. I could be wildly gesticulating, slightly off screen, you wouldn't see that. So body language, but also the tone, the purity of the tone of voice is restricted when it's delivered via a mic. And even the words, sometimes it's harder to hear. So that can definitely happen. Yeah. So, Nancy, I'm going to ask you a little bit about progress. How can we measure progress when we are, when we're remote, when we've got cultural differences? How do we do that?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest differences that I think trips up global teams in particular, especially when they're different time zones, different cultures. I'll just give a quick example. There was a new supervisor. She was here in the U.S. and her colleague Maria in Italy kept saying, "No, I'll get that to you," because I had said it. The team had established a deadline and a day. It wasn't coming through. It wasn't coming through. So my colleague in the U.S. said, right, I'll just give her the benefit of the doubt because I know there are cultural differences. So I know that we have different notions of punctuality. So I'm going to give her time. Well, in reality, Maria never did deliver. So it wasn't a cultural differences, but the US supervisor didn't know how to approach it because she thought, oh, I don't want to be ethnocentric and assume that everyone has the same notions of punctuality. So I think for a global team to be very explicit about if it's Wednesday or at the end of the week, define what end of the week is, take into account time zone differences when you establish end of the week. And then also, what I think is important is different cultures crave different levels of detail in their reporting. So, as a team, agree on what level of detail needs to be included in the status report and where that status report will appear and by when. So, I think those are some of the differences. So how about you? What do you see as another big difference that can trip up global teams?
Yeah, something that can trip people up is when you're not sure whether people have really understood what you have been talking about. So it can be really helpful, rather than saying, "Have you understood what I've been saying?" when the typical answer would be yes, is to just ask people to summarize what's been agreed. So that can be really good. You don't have to ask the same person over and over again, but perhaps go around the group getting people to summarize at key points. And I'd say that open questions are really helpful. If you have closed questions, have you agreed? Do you understand? People will typically say yes, or perhaps they'll just be silence. Whereas you could ask something like, what do you like or not like about this idea? Or what have you understood as the key point in this discussion? Then you can get an idea whether somebody's really with you or not. And also it's face saving, which, as I learned early on, is actually really important. Pretty much, well, with lots of people and people who are in or have their origins are from anywhere from the Middle East right through to Japan. It can be there as an issue. And again, when you're working virtually, it's harder to see. It's harder to hear people's voice tone. So it's harder to tell whether people have really got it. So asking people, what did you understand? As opposed to saying, did you get what I just said? That would be inappropriate.
Also, one of the reasons it's inappropriate because you would use the word get, which, as we said, has so many different meanings.
Absolutely.
And something you said earlier, Penny, about allowing more time, I think here is where paraphrasing. So yes, you can ask someone, I'd like to ask so-and-so, or can someone paraphrase what I just said? Oftentimes we'll need to do the paraphrasing if we see a bunch of faces that register either nothing or confusion. Then we may say, let me try that again. I think I wasn't clear. So own the lack of clarity and then paraphrase. And then in it, well, in face to face or not, but it's so much more difficult in a virtual world to listen deeply what's being said or not being said. So you started with your example, Penny, about the colleague in India who said yes, it can be ready, and because that person wanted to save you face and wanted to save themselves face. So I think it is important to look at the expression. Pixelated images, it's hard to do, but it's possible. And ask someone. So if I ask my colleague from Japan, how did it go? And he said, fine, but his face belies a different answer, then I would ask him offline, privately, how it really went. And he told me that in Japan, he said, we sometimes have an expression to say you have 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 1 mouth. So I realized he was criticizing me a little, very gently, for not listening deeply enough. So I think to be successful working across cultures, you have to be really genuinely curious about what someone's thinking and care about what they're thinking.
There's something else that is really important. That is respect the national holidays of all team members, and also when people's weekends are. So, I mean, something that I've noticed is that people have very different weekends in different parts of the world. So, when I work in Qatar and Dubai, Friday, Saturday is the weekend. Whereas Saturday, Sunday would be the norm for North America, for example. But the national holidays as well, it can be a logistical nightmare. I can remember a team where we had some American colleagues and some French colleagues, and the Americans are really keen to have a major delivery in August. And it was, no, we won't be there in August. We are off on August. And the Americans were going, hang on, we get 10 days per year, and you're saying you're having the whole of August off. And it was, there are big differences. So plan meetings and understand when people will be around. Does everybody actually need to be there? Could we actually still do some work in August without the French colleagues? Does everybody have to be there all the time? And some of the Americans were quite keen to have the French to dial in from their holidays, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, was a complete and utter no-no. So, think in advance. What do we need to do? What are we going to do around August or whatever it might be for the national religious holidays for people from different parts of the world? Yeah.
Penny, can I just add something there?
Of course you can.
I have a calendar. It's called the Harvard Planner, but there are plenty of calendars that have international holidays. I think it's really important as a team to ask which holidays are sacrosanct, which should you never schedule a deliverable or a meeting, and which are not as important. So, for example, here in the US, it might be Indigenous Peoples Day. Most offices wouldn't take that off. I'll say most, some schools do, or Flag Day, Arbor Day. There's some holidays that don't have much meaning.
But I
And
couldn't
I
schedule
know,
something for Thanksgiving. Even I know that.
yeah, or the day after, because that's Black Friday.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think it's important as a team to not only be aware of, and then there's state holidays. Massachusetts has its own peculiar holiday that no other state has. So I think it's important as a team to say which holidays should we avoid at all costs and which are okay to schedule time. Because if you paid attention to every single state and national holiday, you would probably not have many days to meet. So I think it's just good to have that conversation.
Brilliant, thank you. So, yeah, one more thing is to think about not just making sure you're all clear on holidays, but also making sure that you use the same systems of communication and that everyone knows how to use it. So, what tools are you going to use in your team? What tools do people prefer? Things like email, instant messages. Are you going to have a team portal? Are you going to have project software and so on? How are we going to use it is probably the most important, isn't it, Nancy? How frequently do we update people? Who do we update? Who gets copied in? Do we have to copy everybody in all the time? If you do that on email, you will end up with your mailboxes exploding. How quickly do we expect people on the team to respond? When do we expect people to answer or deal with a problem? There will be differences in language and communication styles, but we need to set that and agree as a team. How are we going to do things as a team? What are our norms going to be in terms of communication?
Yeah, Penny, you've hit on so many important points there. That whole idea about who do we copy on an email, that if you don't agree on that, that can have a devastating impact on the trust and credibility of people on the team. There's some cultures that are very hierarchical in nature, where everything's got to go to the top and back down. There are others where you share widely and easily and broadly with vast swaths of people. So I think how information flows, the level of detail we want in our communications, and you talked about how quickly we respond, that will be very different in one country versus another. So again, it goes back to creating a team culture with some agreed upon norms. And that's why discussing the differences are so important. You can't get to that without understanding where everyone's coming from.
Now, Nancy, I'm going to bring in a comment from Laurie, who says, one challenge I face if a non-native person is working in the US and is not fitting in, and there's a desire for them to change their speech or communication on the part of the company, but they are not on board. Do we have any comments? We've got some comments from people in the group. Jessica suggests, I guess, finding out where the desire to change is coming from. Is it coming out of necessity in order to do the job, or is it something else? If they're able to continue to do the job the way they're doing it, then perhaps there may be no desire to change on their end, and rightly so. Going back to Laura, she says when she's contacted, it's normally affecting the job or career growth. Any initial thoughts on that, Nancy?
Yeah, I do have a few. One is, as Jessica asked, where is that request coming from, and what is the kind of bias or the perception of that person? Another is that their linguistic bias is a very real bias, and by that I mean if certain people have certain accents, and some accents are more acceptable than others. English accents, oh, that sounds nice, or French accents, but certain other countries, like, I don't understand what you're saying. So I think if the person is understandable and can communicate well, understand and enunciate clearly, that really should be enough. I don't believe in trying to suppress accents just because some people have a hard time tuning in. I think it is incumbent on all of us. I think of it as like a radio, like I'm tuning into the right channel. So if someone's speaking with an accent that I'm having a tough time understand, I really take the time. I often close my eyes to listen deeply, to tune into that frequency, and suddenly I understand everything. But if I just stay like this, I don't understand what you're saying, then I may never, and I may put up that wall. So I think it also depends on what the job is. Uh,
Yeah.
but if the person can speak clearly and it's
Yeah.
understandable, I don't know. I don't think they should have to change.
I think certainly it could be reasonable to ask someone who maybe speaks very quickly to slow down so that it's easier for others to tune in. Yeah, Laurie's commenting that she evaluates intelligibility. That's a big word. And that can be a big challenge. And she agrees with us up to a point. So as long as people are intelligible, without people having to work too hard or being impossible to understand, I think that's key. But certainly if people do need help, then perhaps with slowing down or just making it easier for people to understand, that I think would make sense. Right, so Nancy, you're keen on virtual water coolers. Would you like to explain a bit more about those?
Yeah, I think when we have distributed teams, especially those that cross time zones, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find a time where everyone can meet in real time. And there's so many tools that allow this now to have asynchronous conversations. So whether it's in a Slack channel, whether it's in a Teams or whatever, there's so many tools different organizations use, but have some areas where people can have especially a social chat. So some of my clients who use Slack may have a project related Slack channel, and then some may have just social, like here's a picture of my dog, here's what I did this weekend, anyone know any good restaurants in Jakarta, or whatever the question is. So I think to have a place where people can get to know each other, um, in a way, or ask questions or share parts of themselves that aren't necessarily coming across in your day-to-day meetings or more formal communications.
Absolutely, and I commented about something similar. LinkedIn is putting all these articles developed by AI, and they keep asking me to add bits. I'm sure they do that with you, Nancy, as a recognized expert. But this is the one that I put in about making sure you have one-to-ones so that you can really connect with people and get to know them. That seems to be the one that more people are liking than anyone else. So, yeah, what else can we do? Something that's quite interesting that I've noticed is that different cultures can have very different ideas of what being on time means. And that's, within countries that are very close. The UK and France can be quite different on this, for example. So we need to agree across the team, what's the real meeting start time? Can we make sure that we will be able to start and work together? What's the maximum flexibility we'll allow? Actually, I found something that works really well in cross-cultural teams can be to say that, for the first 5 minutes, we're going to have a bit of a social chat and a catch up on what's happening in the office, what's happening in the organization, perhaps going almost as far as saying, what's a little bit of gossip, perhaps even, so that there's something that draws people to be there. That can draw people in, and perhaps we might decide that it's okay to update latecomers, perhaps if they're up to 5 minutes late, perhaps. But what we don't want to be doing is every 5 minutes stopping and reintroducing everybody because, the next person comes in at 10 past and then 15 minutes past and then 20 past. So we need to agree what's okay, set out really clearly what expectations are and stick to it. Yeah, so I see that you also like that team chat session at the start of meetings to draw people in and encourage people to get there early.
Yeah, because that way, not only do you build that social capital across the team, kind of adding to that virtual water cooler notion, but also then people have a little bit of slack time that they know, okay, if I don't want social chit chat, or if I'm too busy or I need a comfort break, I'll come in exactly, let's say 9:05. And in terms of catching up latecomers, I think if you have a norm, an agreed upon norm, meetings will start promptly at 5 after the hour.
Hmm.
I I do not catch up latecomers. I think that's really disrespectful for people
Yep.
who came
Yeah.
early. I might say, here's take a look at the pre-work again, or I've attached a link that you, when you're ready to join the conversation, jump in. But I think that just to have that little bit of buffer, and I really get sad when people don't use it and everyone's just saying nothing. And there's signs like, ask a social question, ask who has plans this weekend, or anything, but get a conversation going. Don't just use that as dead space while you wait for people to come on.
Absolutely, because you're not going to be bumping into each other if you're in a virtual team around the water cooler as you would, or the coffee machine, or the kettle.
No.
So, yeah, Nancy, another thing around timing and culture, time zone challenges. So, there are a few things you might want to consider, I expect. I suppose a few questions. If you have wide time zones, do you actually even need to meet in real time? What do you reckon?
Well, I think if it's a sometimes, I mean, I hope, but I think that if you do, I've had some teams. I was on a year and a half long project. It was, I don't even know how many time zones, but we had stereophonic meetings, meaning we had the same meeting with the one group in one time zone, one another, and then we took notes and synthesized notes, which is a lot easier today with tools like Mural or XLeap or any number of tools. But I think not. I think it's great if you can meet, and I think if you have such a huge time zone difference, then rotate the inconvenience. Don't always have the Eastern U.S. 9 a.m., which turned out to be the time that team I mentioned typically met, but have the people in the US have the pleasure of meeting at 5 a.m. or 11 p.m. Just make it fair.
Yeah, I used to be in a global team with someone in Australia, and we shared the load. So there were times when they could all meet, but the poor guy in Australia, it would be the middle of his night. So we did move the time around. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, what's the best way, Nancy, you think, to learn about other cultures?
Well, I think it is to travel or read books, especially historical novels about an area, because I think that can give you real insight into the background and kind of the values and beliefs. So I think fiction in particular is important. Films, yes. I think the best is to be curious and ask people. Find a cultural buddy, a cultural coach. I worked with Toshi, who I mentioned earlier. He was from Tokyo. We were in the same work group here in Massachusetts. He was here for 3 years. He would come. We had lunch every Friday, and he would have this whole list of phrases that were totally confusing to him. Like, he said, "What does it mean when people march down the street and get all wet?" And I said, "I don't know what you mean." And he looked it up. He said, "Don't rain on my parade." What does that mean? I said, "Oh, okay." So he had all these phrases, and then I'd ask him about phrases or words or habits. And so we just learned so much about each other because we decided to make that an intentional conversation that was non judgmental, risk free, very safe. So I think if you can find someone from another culture you're curious about, and you've established some psychological safety around having that conversation, I think that's one of the best ways. And then yeah, to be curious and observe in a non-judgmental way.
I've certainly found it really helpful to have a team, someone I know better, a sort of culture buddy, someone I know well who I can bounce ideas off and say, how do you think this would go down? And really helpful. So something that also comes up in teams when you have to deliver is how do you make decisions? Because that can vary hugely, can't it? So I know Americans tend to want to make quick decisions, whereas some other cultures in Europe would want everyone to be happy and to be involved, and it can seem to the Americans to take forever. What do you
Yeah,
reckon?
I think that's one of the biggest differences and sources of conflict for global teams is how decisions get made, what extent of data is needed to make the decisions, what is the process, what's the criteria, who decides, who must be involved, how it's communicated. There's so many different notions because, as you said, Americans like to go down the checklist. Okay, I actually had one of my clients in a principles workshop I was running, and we talked about how the team needs principles around decision making. He actually said a bad decision is better than no decision was his principle. And I said, wait, if it's truly a bad decision, that means work will have to be redone and et cetera. He said, yeah, but at least we made a decision. We could move on. I said, that perfectly encapsulates the American way of thinking about decision making. Not everyone, but yeah. So we worked on the principle a little more. I said, I really don't think that's what you meant. So I think that it is true that different cultures, let's say colleagues in Japan, everything has to be kind of floated and socialized all across, and ultimately it's the senior leaderships who makes a decision. So it depends on the hierarchy as to who makes the decision, the data needed, etc. But I think when you're working, especially as part of a virtual or remote team, you have to be excruciatingly explicit about the decision making process, and then once it's made, who communicates, how is it communicated, and how it's going to be implemented.
So something that people might be interested in is how can you get an idea of these ranges and these different aspects of culture? And something I found quite useful is Erin Mayer's The Culture Map, but there's also a lot of work by the old guard, Hofstede and Trompenaars. Absolutely, I think I have a yellow version of that book, Nancy. I can remember in the 90s, I spent several days with Trompenaars in Amsterdam, which was absolutely fascinating,
Wow.
finding out about his research there. So I think we're coming near the end, aren't we, Nancy? So if you have any questions and you're on the LinkedIn, now's your last chance to ask them. I think we've got lots of thumbs up, lots of hello and thank you, and yep, no more questions. So I suspect it makes sense to begin to wind down. I'm sure we'll be doing some more. If you would like to hear more from me and Nancy, please do let us know what you'd like to hear from the two of us about. So it's goodbye from me.
Yeah, and I want to leave with just one piece of
Okay.
advice, and this is from Dr. Nancy Adler, whose course I had the privilege of attending many years ago, and that is assume differences unless similarities are proven.
Yep.
Often we hear the opposite, assume that we're all alike. No, assume differences. And that way we won't be tempted to see others through our lens. So that's a piece of advice I'd like to leave you with.
And a very brilliant one that is. So thank you very much. And we can see very useful info. Thank you very much. That was excellent. Thank you, Nancy, so much. And we will be back at some point in the future.
Bye for now. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.